And we're live. Welcome back to the stream, everyone. So this is episode 9 and my first live interview. With me today, I have a dear friend of mine and mentor, Clay Pendergrass. Clay was a SEAL officer for 20 years, give or take, with a short enlisted career prior to that in the SEAL teams. Him and I met probably 2018. Does that sound right to you? Yeah, I would say it was during the whose retirement ceremony was it?
Oh, good question. Might have been 17 even, now that I think about it. 17 or 18, for sure.
Yeah. It was at Ski Yachts.
Yeah.
So we met down in Louisiana or Mississippi when we were both stationed down there. You, I think, at the time were already in Florida, but I was
I'd come back
there as a junior officer in the SEAL teams. And we happened to strike up a conversation with each other during one of the events at the retirement ceremony that we were both at, and have built and maintained a friendship ever since. So I recently left the service a few months ago. Clay was shortly before that, after a long stint with some medical issues that he has now put at least partially behind him.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to talk about what some of the universal traits to leadership are, or at least we are going to try to talk around them as best as we're able to manage it. But before that, Clay, is there anything else that you would like to discuss in terms of who you are, where you're from, what your experience is?
You kind of covered it. I did a little over 30 years in the SEAL teams. I was enlisted for a couple platoons, got commissioned, retired in 2023. As Evan said, particularly the latter half, last 10 years, I had over 30 surgeries, so that was kind of my constant battle. But I was also really fortunate in a lot of the people I got to be around, particularly I did 2 tours at U.S. SOCOM, Special Operations Command, working directly and answering to the 4-star. So I got to see some really good senior leadership and some other examples too that, something you and I talk about all the time, Evan, and I guess we'll carry that into this conversation. So Appreciate you having me here.
Yeah. This is exciting. We've been talking about doing this for a number of years now.
Yeah.
And now finally we're both in a position to do so. So I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. And I suspect it'll be the first of many interesting discussions. So
yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Back to our topic. One of the issues that you run into with the leadership literature, particularly on the academic side, and sometimes on the mainstream author side, you have the John Maxwells, the Jockos, the Simon Sineks, the contemporary thought leaders in the leadership world. And then on the academic side, you have a lot of discussion about leadership traits, which is a interesting discussion to have. There's a lot of personality literature behind it. There's a lot of cognitive literature behind it, but there's very, very little agreement on a universal set of leadership traits. And even the ones that are agreed upon, they are generally conceptualized as something that are innate and stable over the long term, such as personality traits like conscientiousness and intelligence and openness to experience and low neuroticism and moderate amounts of agreeableness, but not too much or not too little. Otherwise, you won't stand your ground, or you concede ground too much when you shouldn't. So things like personality and IQ are really hard to change over time. It's really, really easy to make someone dumber, but it's really hard to make someone smarter from an IQ perspective. You give someone too many carbohydrates over too many years, you make them dumb. But but exactly. It's really hard to make them smarter from a ceiling perspective. So the question is, well, if there's a universal set of leadership traits, well, what might they be? And these traits are things that are innate. Are there parts of them, aspects of them that are developmental, or, or are you able to develop certain aspects of those traits? And if so, to what degree, and how do you do that? And then another question that's worth discussing is, in addition to the traits, what might be some subsets of those traits and associated skill sets that are a bit more accessible in terms of developmental strategies. So that's kind of the direction that we're going to go, or I think we should at least start off, and we'll see where we get.
Sure. You want me to kick off some of my thoughts
Yeah.
on the stuff you and I talked about? So, I, like you, have read a lot. You get fed a lot, quite frankly, especially if you do enough time in the military, which is a good thing. I'm not knocking it, but I find often the people that we contract to, or the books that we want to read to start with, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are too much on the academic side, and it's still this kind of ivory tower view. It's for me, it's the Thucydides. The nation that draws too great a divide between its warriors and scholars will soon find its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. And so there's something in a lot of the literature when I read it that is missing the blue collar, what I call the blue collar leadership. The reason they know it works is because they've had hands on. They know if you swing a hammer incorrectly, the consequences. There's something grounding in, if your hand, my grandfather used to say, get some callus on your hands, boy. And that phrase has stuck with me. Like, if you are just in the theoretical, then it's easy to have any theory, including on leadership. And you can read history and understand it academically, but unless you've actually got your hands dirty to some extent, it's really hard. So I would say, to start with, there needs to be, in any research on any subject, including leadership, there needs to be a understanding of the balance between, I guess, getting your hands dirty, being a part of it, seeing it, feeling it, touching it, and then also being able to explore the concepts. I don't think you can do one apart the other and come out with a great product.
Yeah. I think the utility, or at least one of the utilities in research, the academic side of leadership development, is that you are able to learn lessons from thousands of years of human history. And when you're in a profession that risks life, limb, or eyesight, law enforcement, military, and even some blue collar jobs like linemen, you are failing your people if you are not actively reading and developing yourself, because there's no replacement for experience, but the speed at which you accumulate experience has some constraints on it. There's not enough time in the day to learn everything that you want to learn, and everything that you need to learn as a leader. So reading, I think, does a couple things. It allows you to glean lessons from human history faster, and you accumulate knowledge, which can help refine your mental models, which will help you reflect better on the experience that you do accumulate with your bare hands by actually being in the problem.
Well, I'd add, I guess, two corollaries to that. And one is, the way I hear what you say is, there's no replacement for experience. And as you point out, you have one life of experience. But if you read, in theory, you can have thousands of lives of experience. You're still accumulating experience through a filter of what they went through. And that requires particularly, and you can become more sophisticated in your understanding, like perspective for sure, like to understanding what that was actually like. If you're reading Ulysses S. Grant or Alexander the Great, and you don't understand actually what history looked like at that time, including disease, sanitation, like all those other things, you're not really getting a concept of what they were dealing with. And so leadership is dealing with a problem that is at hand. And so, again, as I'm going back to, so again, I said two corollaries. One is understand that what you're trying to do is accumulate more experience than you could normally acquire by actual experience in your lifetime. That's what you're trying to onboard. And you're trying to onboard it correctly, or I should say wholly, to understand the problem. And again, going back to the literature, what I have found is there's, and again, not all of it, but a good portion of it is almost a sanitized version of, particularly if they're looking at historical leadership, and they don't treat it as the leadership in that time. And I think for you to really understand what you're onboarding when it's a study of previous leadership is you got to really understand history and people in history. So, and that opens up to things you and I've talked about as well. The psychology of people, is really the backbone of any study of leadership. I mean, you're leading people, you manage things. It sounds cliche, but and I would say, well, I guess I'll bring it back. So those are the two things I would add to what we're talking about in terms of literature. But in terms of universal traits that I just think you can't teach, that you need to have, the first one I would have is, and I would tell any leaders who are looking to hire future leaders, find somebody who's genuinely curious about the world. If somebody has curiosity, then they're always looking at solutions. They're always trying to understand the problem. It, to me, is a buttress against what I label as fundamentalist thought. The fundamentalist, which we normally attribute to religion, but it's anywhere where somebody says, I know the answer. There's no other possible answer. And a problem with leadership is it becomes more senior, you can have the hubris to think you know. Whereas I think one of the things that counters that is people who are more genuinely curious and get excited over what they don't know. Like, oh shit, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. That level of curiosity will guard you against fundamentalist thinking, or it keeps you open. And by the way, it keeps you open in a invitation to play too. I think if you're really genuinely curious and you're really excited about finding out something new, it translates into what am I looking for? The atmosphere, the culture that you set where everybody else is okay to be curious. And you encourage that. And so I would say, I'll pause there for you, but I think the number one thing I look for in people, and by the way, you have in spades, I think that's the thing that when we first met that I really enjoyed was your curiosity about everything. And I'm like, oh, cool. That's a mind that wants to be filled.
It's interesting the circumstances under which we met, because shortly before that in my life, I didn't have the degree of curiosity that I did when you and I met. That kind of emerged early on in my time in Mississippi. Well, I was living in Louisiana, but we were working on the Mississippi side of the state. And I was down there by myself, no friends, very little professional contacts. So I spent a lot of time by myself that first year. So it was a lot of, there's a fair degree of soul searching, and I rekindled a intellectual curiosity that I had lost from when I was a kid or a teenager, because of how brutal, I believe, the academic rigors are of the Naval Academy.
Yeah.
So it kind of crushed my intellectual curiosity because I was just always drowning in work. And whether that's justified or not, it's just what happened.
On a side note, let me say this for also parents or future parents and leaders, and it's actually a huge pet peeve of mine in all school systems, including universities. If you're teaching somebody to read, for instance, it doesn't matter if they're reading don't get them to read Tessa de Ubervilles. If they don't kill somebody's curiosity, find what they're curious about and support their growth of learning. I loved, you know, the Ben Carson story. Have you ever heard him? I don't know why that just came to mind. I get
I'm
almost
not sure.
teary eyed. You know who Ben Carson is?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to paraphrase this. So, fatherless, low income, single mom. And I'll probably get emotional. This is one of my favorite stories. So, hold on. Let's back up for those who don't know Ben Carson. Ben Carson he must be in his 60s, I would guess, late 60s, maybe, black man. Um, became a neurosurgeon, came from nothing. I mean, really came from nothing. No father, single mom, welfare, you know, kind of background. Became a neurosurgeon. Then became a pediatric neurosurgeon, right? So you're now in the what 0.000 whatever percent. Then became pediatric neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins. Then became head pediatric neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins. I think he's the first person to like successfully separate Siamese twins in the womb. Like his accolades are insane, and he's this beautifully calm guy. But he tells this story that he was getting very angry even as a kid, you know, growing up. And I don't know. It sounds like I'm guessing around 8 or 9. His mom started to make him read and write book reports. He could read whatever he wanted and make him write these reports. And he was so mad. He wanted to be outside roaming with the other kids who were getting into trouble, blah, blah, blah. But she held him down. And over time, what he said is he really liked like adventure stories and hero stories like most young boys. And he started to not see the captain of the ship or the Antarctic explorer or the person exploring whatever as black or white. He just saw them as men. And he started to see himself as somebody who could be like that. And it was through that reading constantly that it really opened up his world to how much he loved to learn. And by the way, the best part of that story is when he was, I think, 12 or 13, he realized his mom that's what the other thing, his mom had been grading. You know, she marked up all of his book reports, you know, with a red ink. And somewhere along the line, he realized his mom was illiterate. Gets me. I love that. But she knew the way out for her boys was to read. That's all she knew. And so she stuck to it. And I'm like, that's one of the most beautiful parenting stories I've ever heard. That's the story of leadership. That's the story of making sure the people under your charge are curious. And it starts with just being about curious, whatever they want to be curious about. And I promise you, it'll expand out. Like, it's such a beautiful gift. And
I love that. I mean, what's so cool about reading is how low a barrier to entry is. You know, everyone. I shouldn't say everyone, because some people are unfortunate enough to where they don't know how to read, and strangely, that number seems to be increasing these days in terms of illiteracy in American high schools. But that's.
But I would tell them, on a note though, I would tell them. That's the beautiful thing about podcasts now. I mean, I'm obviously a giant dork and love.
Oh yeah, but this is a great point.
Hey man, find a podcast that interests you.
Yeah,
like
and everyone's got a phone.
To me. Yeah, and by the way, this gets back to, do you know who Eric Weinstein is? Like, you know, so smart it makes my head hurt. But he was talking about when he started to see the algorithms of, you know, and for people who don't know Eric Weinstein, he's a brilliant mathematician and physicist and economist. He works with was like Peter Thiel's right-hand man, and fascinating guy. I mean, my Lord, when he goes into rabbit holes about Indian instruments from, you know, 1750s, or like, he just one of those people. But he was talking about when he started to see the algorithms on his podcast, that the majority of the people listening to his podcast were blue-collar men, plumbers, electricians, truck drivers. And he was like, wait, what? Because academia says, no, you know, these are, and it's like, no.
It's too far over their head.
Yeah, and no, that's his audience. Blue-collar men who are dorking out over all the things he dorks out over. And he's, you know, this well-established, you know, academic background. And I love that. And that goes back to, I think, the greatest gift you can do as a leader at an individual and cultural level is make sure that curiosity flourishes. If you do that, problems get solved.
And I think what we've been talking around here and what you and I have discussed privately is there seems to be this universal trait of good leaders where they have a orientation towards pursuing the truth.
Yes.
And I say
They
that
aren't scared of it.
yes, they aren't scared of it. They don't claim to have ownership of it. They acknowledge that they will never achieve it fully, but they are still oriented towards pursuing it. And that's what allows them, I think, and we think, to be playful with the intellectual landscape and to be curious and to seek out knowledge and to encourage others to do the same and encourage
Right.
others to challenge their assumptions and to challenge their presuppositions and to push back on their ideas so that a better idea can be generated.
Yeah. And I would claim there are some who were better. Every great leader I knew loved curiosity in their people. Now, some were more open about, like McCraven was always big thinker and loved big ideas, and you felt that around him. There were others, I think Brian Losey, General Thomas were that way, where they pushed back a lot harder. Like you had to have your shit in a row, but it was so much fun that if you did, they just wanted to make sure you weren't just off in la la land. You actually thought
Like they
it
would
through.
play along with you if you
Well,
knew what you
they
were
would
talking
push
about.
back. Yeah. It would still play, but it was more harsh, I would say, more rough and tumble play, if you will, where they wanted to push back. Like, are you ready? Are you going to stand by what you're thinking? Have you really thought this through before you come to me? But if you did, in fact, both of those guys I just named were great at, once you had crossed that Rubicon, man, they had your back without a doubt. Like they were, and would call on you because they were interested. They just was like making sure you're not just kind of talking out of your ass or in la la land. So,
Yeah.
but my point is, in both models, the person who's more openly kind of joyful about every good idea, and then the leaders who seem at first to push back, the ones who embrace in the end the real curiosity and new ideas and looking at things, every one of those were great leaders. Because there's some who push back and never listen to anything. That's not the same thing, to be clear. I'm talking about those who really, in the end, you realize they love curiosity. They love, how are you attacking this problem? How are you looking at it? And all of those, I ended up having great relationships with a whole bunch of senior leaders that I really respected. And I was surprised. Votel was that way too. Like, just amazing at encouraging you, in each of them their different way. And you'd like genuinely excited, like they'd smile, like, wait, what? And then you'd get excited because you realize, oh, I've hooked them. They're actually seeing.
I'm not crazy.
Like, yeah, I'm not crazy. And they're like, I love that. And I loved watching great leaders in my mind. That was, I would say, all of them had curiosity. In the end, it was a main trait of who they were at some level.
I mean, I obviously never did it at the level that those folks did it, but you at every level of the organization, whenever you're in a position of leadership, you get your own taste of that, and then it expands and becomes more sophisticated and more. The consequences of those conversations, decisions expand in scope and impact, but at every level, a leader has an opportunity to have that conversation with their own subordinates, and I did my best to try to foster that with my junior leaders, and there are a lot of things that I screwed up, and I think I did a lot of things right too, but I did put a lot of effort into trying to mentor my junior leaders to do things like that. And every time they came back to me with something that I had tasked them with, that they really bit into and did their homework and were able to withstand the intellectual gymnastics that me and my right hand, in terms of our leadership team, put them through. Like, I was like secretly rooting for them to like be right.
Yeah.
I was always rooting for them to like prove me wrong.
By the way, let me add on that. One of the things that all great leaders do is, if it turns out you're wrong, but your process was right, they would be like, no worries, and I stole this and used to say this all the time, probably to you too, like, hey, no worries, now we know the right answer. Next time, we'll go left instead of right. And you say, go make more decisions, go figure it out. Like, you still encourage. It's so easy when something doesn't go well. And particularly if you have a boss who demands everything, be perfect, and you got to have the fortitude to go, actually, they didn't do anything. They weren't unethical, immoral, or illegal. They were trying to get to the right answer, and they just, they made a mistake here and there. And the leaders who want to crush that is terrible. Well, if they keep doing it, there eventually is a competency issue. But I have found that to be so rare. And the best thing you can do is encourage people. And again, go back and look at who were the best ace pilots in World War II. I forgot some crazy percentage of them got shot down. Like, so they learned, hey, don't bank left when they learned from a mistake, survived the mistake. And now, when you get into this zero fault mentality, I think it's a similar to somebody who's not curious. Like, again, it's a fundamentalist. Well, I clearly already know the answer. I wouldn't have made that mistake. And I'm like, really? Okay. Must be nice to be God. I stumble through life making all kinds of mistakes and, fail my way upward. So
I think another trait, and I'm not sure if this is nested under, the pursuit of truth. But there's a certain degree of humility too that's required in leadership, and it's unclear to me just how much, but it is clear to me that there is some.
Well, I think
there has to be enough to where you have to acknowledge that, like, you don't know everything, and you don't have to be the one to solve every problem, and you have a team for that.
I think you're describing, that's exactly what I'm describing when I talk about fundamentalist thinking says I know. Again, I know you and I've talked about this. I always love the Albert Einstein. What I've learned is I know next to nothing. And he actually, I can't remember something I was reading, he was describing at some really kind of deep level that every time Socrates has some similar thoughts of every time he learned something, what he actually learned was he had two or more questions to the new thing he learned. So everything he learned exponentially increased the questions, if that makes sense. And so most of us don't really have a conception of the infinite. I think most humans have this idea that it's just really big. But if I learn some things, I start to fill this big void, right? And I'm at some feeling level of humans is that I'm filling up the void. Instead of, I think when you really are curious and open, you realize the more you know, the more you're aware of the infinite. Like, you absolutely don't know everything. You certainly don't know every variable involved. At the same time, you still have to make a decision. And so you have to be able to go, okay, I've got to make a decision. This is enough information to go on, and understand that I don't have all the information, right? It's both. And so the humility, and I know I work out, and I talk in archetypical terms. So that's, to me, the Tower of Babel story, or it's the Yggdrasil, which I can barely pronounce. The tree of life, is masculine, and the roots of the masculine tree are in the universe, the feminine, and the feminine is chaos. It's infinite. It's where all the new information is. The masculine.
Nope.
Again, I'm not talking genders. I'm talking about these archetypes. And so it's the balance of those two things, meaning you have to make a decision. Left brain, your grasping brain, it wants to move somewhere. But if you're not always aware that all the new information is coming in from the right brain, generally speaking, it's the new information is on the feminine or the chaos or the infinite side. So you have to always be open that there's something you don't know. And that way you're always updating with the tree, if you will. Like otherwise, if you cut that off, you eventually die because you're cutting off the source of all new everything. And so understanding that conceptually, I think is huge to go, maybe you know more than well, again, it's the Einstein who probably knew arguably more than anybody else in the world, certainly at the time with, maybe Niels Bohr and a couple of others in terms of physics. And his conclusion was he knew almost nothing. And so I think that's a deeply profound place to be for all leaders. And again, finding the joy. So there's a disposition. It's not just being curious. There's something about great leaders that are joyful in what they don't know. You know what I mean? Like they're like, when you tell them some new way to skin a cat and you see their face like light up, that's what I'm talking about. Or I've experienced that time and time again when, whatever, some lower enlisted comes up and tells you something. Or have you ever done, I remember one time, it's a great example. I was trying to fix something under the sink, and my oldest child was like 2. And he kept trying to look under the sink, when there's no room. And I had a flashlight. I was trying to see where it's coming from, and he kept trying to get in. And I was like, buddy, like, I don't have time right now. And he kept looking and was in my way. I was getting frustrated. And I was just about to kind of snap at him. And he goes, what's that right there? And he pointed at something I wasn't looking at. And it was the source of belief. And I was like, damn it. Like my 2-year-old just showed me what I couldn't see right in front of me, because he was squatting down with the child's eyes. He was open to all of it, and if you can't laugh at that.
And you had made your conclusion already.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't need to listen to this piece too. What can he possibly know? It turns out he knows more than me.
I'm getting some interference on your end. I'm not sure if it's because you're animated when you talk and move around and the upload download speed is getting haywire, but
okay, I'll try
let's troubleshoot and do process of elimination here, and let's just talk without moving for a couple minutes and see if that fixes the issue.
Yeah, that's
I know that might be hard for you.
Yeah, exactly. My doppelganger is Woody the cowboy. So
yeah,
fair enough. Hopefully that helps by my stoic physical demeanor.
So we have a orientation towards truth.
Mm-hmm.
We have humility, whether that's nested in the first one or not. It's hard to tell if they're two separate.
I claim that it is.
Or not. Yeah, I would lean more towards it being nested in the first, but let's see if we can come up with a separate construct or a distinct construct outside of a pursuit of truth that makes a good leader.
Well, I can. So I would say, we talked before. I had 3 things that I think are universal that you can't teach, right? And the first we've covered is curiosity, and again, it's another way of saying an orientation to the truth. And there's a whole bunch of things you can get into in terms of tools, whether that's Chesterton's fence or cost-benefit analysis, point of diminishing return, different principles. There's all kinds of tools you can use to figure out, am I really oriented or seeing the truth? But you have to have an orientation to the truth. The second one, I think, is humor. And that's what I really mean is the state of play. Like, you have to be playful in your approach to everything, even really difficult things. Like, I can think of a couple of times, I'm not trying to tell a war story, but where something heavy is happening, combat-wise or just stress-wise, whatever that is, in the teams you run across that. Even certainly in training, you can have that too. And I found that even in some of the most intense moments, and you can see, particularly a younger guy who's, it's not that they're doing something wrong, but you can see that that the event is bigger than what they're taking in the moment. And if you can go and make them laugh in that moment, it's amazing how much it shifts everything. Like right in that moment. if you can come in and go, hey, I think that guy's trying to kill us or whatever, just to break that, it shifts, it downshifts into play just a little bit. And what that does is open up your right hemisphere. Like, again, Ian McGilchrist's work is great on this, but understanding that what I mean by state of play is that you are being balanced between, I would say, something like the balance between truth and feeling, or truth and love, perhaps. I think the yin yang is an indication of that, 1 foot in order, 1 foot in chaos. And we know that the maximum neuro firing for learning is a state of play. And humor is one of the main things to keep you in a state of play. So if you're training, whatever you're training, high risk training, jiu-jitsu, striking, accountants too, whatever, if you want the person or people you're training to onboard at a higher rate, you need to stay in a state of play rather than a state of competition. That doesn't mean that you don't have a time to compete. It's just much less than most people think. And that even high intensity training can still be done in a state of play, right? And it's important. And so I would say humor, the ability to laugh and the ability to be playful, is a key element of any great leader. Because for the reasons I just described. So that was seeking truth, but trying to do it as an invitation to play. And then the third thing we can come back to, which gets into the humility, is I think you have to have some level of empathy. If you don't care about people, then you need to go manage things. But leading is about people. And if you're not curious about people, so again, it goes back to truth, but empathetic of, particularly the more senior I got, like the regrets I have when I go back and think of somebody that I'm like, I didn't help that person as much as I think I could have. And I almost always come back to wondering what was going on in their life. Like, I think about when I was younger and I saw guys who I was like, man, that guy's just not performing. And I'd be irritated that, why are they here if they can't perform? And then as I started to have, surgery after surgery after surgery, and it was in pain, and I go back and think, like, God dang, was that person, I have no idea. The rate of injury in the teams is off the charts. I'm like, were they going through divorce? What was going on in their life?
Mm-hmm.
Where were they? And, I really regret the younger me not being more empathetic and, again, curious about the people around me. And sometimes just listening to people is the best thing you can do as a leader, just letting them know that you're actually listening with an empathetic ear. And so the humility for me also comes in. If you're truly empathetic to people, life's hard. That's Buddha's fourth great truth. Life is difficult. Once you truly accept that life is difficult, it's no longer personal. It's just part of life. You don't go around with a victim mentality. But being empathetic that, man, there's no one going through life if they've been around for a bit. It's like, I don't know what everybody's complaining about. There's not a single issue. Like, everybody has somebody they know that's sick, if not themselves, or dying, or they're stressed in some way. And so if you can't you still need to have accountability. We can get into it. I think you can teach, but a key element of all leadership, political, military, whatever, is accountability. And the lack of accountability will destroy a family, it'll destroy an individual, it'll destroy an organization, it'll destroy a country, for sure. But, man, you've got to have a level of inherent empathy about people.
I'm going to pull myself off screen here and adjust my desk.
Sure. And one of the things you brought up earlier, we can tie it all back. If you are curious and you have a sense of humor, then it can be dark humor. In fact, I really like dark humor. And you are truly empathetic. Those are the key elements. If you have those, you can be a great leader. And you can learn a lot. And then there's all kinds of things you can do to learn. But I would say the first thing you need to learn is about yourself. And it took me a while to figure that out too. And so I know you and I have talked about, if you start understanding yourself, then you can really start understanding other people. And so there's a bunch of different personality models. I personally like a bunch of them because they each have something, whether it's Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or Clifton Strengths with the Big Five personality. As you get into your own psychology and understanding what makes you tick, your, so to speak, your ups and your downs, kind of what you were talking about earlier with some of the literature, then you can understand how you would go about onboarding this new information at being a better leader. But everybody's different. I mean, just learning styles alone. Some people are visual, sometimes they're auditory, sometimes they're, they have to have hands-on. They can't conceptualize it. It's all of those things, just to name a small thing. But if you have to start understanding yourself and what all those different things mean in terms of your personality and how you function physiologically. I know I told you before, I'm a walking Snickers commercial. If I don't eat, I get hangry and I'm short-tempered, et cetera. So I need to onboard that myself. But once you start understanding yourself and you have the right curiosity, you can start seeing in other people like, oh, okay, what's going on there? You can help guide them and encourage them to start understanding themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's a beautiful journey. I love being, especially if I'm in a leadership position, to really encourage people to find out about themselves, including where like as a young man, no one asked me, and I started to do this, as I got more senior, is to ask guys, where is it that you really want to go in life? And how do I help you get there? Not just in terms of being, a better SEAL operator, but, what are you thinking? Family? Where do you want to live? What are you interested in? How do I help you be the whole person that you want to be? And so many people don't ever stop to really think about that. So then you're asking, well, then what are you aimed at? Like you have to have some idea of what you're aimed at to hit the target. And so I think helping people on that journey is really what leadership is about, to be honest.
Back to your point about empathy, mm-hmm. I have a suspicion that this is part of the reason why young people struggle with leadership so much is because they have such little life experience that it impacts their empathy. They haven't lived enough to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes. You don't have enough mm-hmm. life experience. So I think part of the leadership development process is just living more life. Now there's lots of ways that you can do that. You can pack more experiences in per unit of time, and you can read and you can distill other people's lives and integrate it into your own, and it speeds up that process. But empathy is a really, really mature cognitive phenomenon. And if you don't have the life experience, it's hard to put yourself in other people's shoes. And if you can't put yourself in other people's shoes, then how are you going to influence them?
And I would say, as a leader, if you're not empathetic, especially for a lot of people who hasn't come from an empathetic family or background, how are they supposed to map that? Like you have to show them empathy so they have some idea that, oh wow, somebody cares about me. What does caring about me do? Again, and I go back to, I know I sometimes sounds a little woo-woo, but I do think you open doors, whatever you want to call it, frequencies, energetic, whatever. You can really help people
bad connection.
Why?
So you cut out. That's okay.
Right.
You can really help people is where you got cut off.
Yeah, you can help people by opening whatever that is. And again, I go back to curiosity, making them be okay with being curious about their own empathy. Like it's okay. Like make it safe. Sometimes I hate that word, but that is in essence.
Oh man, I hate that phrase, but there's no way around it.
No, but that's what you're doing. You're making it okay, and you're encouraging it. You're like, hey man, this is a great road to be on, and you help map why.
I had to reframe that phenomenon because I had such an issue with the word association to making them feel strong enough to do things. Because I could not get on board with safe spaces. It irked me.
Those are the worst damn things that, again, so you want to get to psychological. We know in psychotherapy, what do? You talk or look at or whatever, deal with the thing that bothers you until it doesn't bother you. Avoiding the thing that bothers you makes you weaker, not stronger. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to, I think about this with my own 3 boys, and certainly particularly the more senior I got, your job in the end is to make everybody in your charge stronger. And we can have a debate about what that means. But
I got into a debate with one of my professors when I was in my psychology of leadership program early mm-hmm. on, and I learned my lesson after I did it because it just wasn't worth the effort. But we were talking about psychologically safe spaces, and I was like, I can't get on board with this. Like, why is it better to make people safer and therefore weaker instead of making them stronger and more competent and willing to stand their ground and voice their opinions? Like, how is this better in the long run? It might be better in the short run to make a psychologically safe space, but like,
I don't even think it's safer in the short run. It's
safe?
Delusional.
How safe is safe?
Right. There's no such thing in the real world.
Yeah.
They're fake worlds by fake people who are too pathetic, quite frankly, to be able to deal. Anybody who's doing that and facilitating that is harming the people under their charge. That's I very harsh about that. That's ridiculous. Your job is to make them stronger. Now, a lot of people hear that and they're like, "Oh, you got to beat them," or That's not what I'm saying. But you're supposed to do the thing that makes it. Like, for instance, let's say somebody's really scared of something, whatever that is. Your job is to get them voluntarily as much as you can, because that's the other thing we know. You can't force somebody to be brave. That's not true. What you do is, you know this in training, crawl, walk, run, right? You get people comfortable at a level, and then you increase the pressure, whatever that is, and you get them comfortable at the next level. And the next one, what you really do is expanding you can think of this in terms of neuroscience, you're expanding their map of their left brain, which is the things they are comfortable with and are no longer scared of, right? But you do that by giving them voluntarily. They have to voluntarily, and so you have to make it okay for them to volunteer and explain why it's brave and courageous to do so, whatever that is, including going to a therapist. Like guys who have PTSD or have real issues or something, how do you help them understand that no, that's to make you stronger under the right conditions, and you take it in a big enough dose that you can still handle whatever that is, and you just keep increasing it, and they get stronger and stronger and stronger. Again, if you can look at it at a generational level, why do we call the greatest generation the greatest generation? They grew up in the Great Depression, then they went to World War II. After that, what were you going to do to them? Like, at a generation, they were like, bring it, they got stronger, and by the way, kinder too. You know this, like you roll all the time and stuff. In my experience, when somebody's at a really high level of striking or jujitsu or almost anything that's in that, with rare exceptions, but most people who are at that level actually get kinder. Mm-hmm. Like, they don't get more, because they understand the journey. That's I love, once I understood, one of the phrases I always had a problem with is the meek shall inherit the earth. And I thought, man, that just doesn't translate in my experience. But once you understand the term meek, and I think it's Old Hebrew or Old Greek, means those who master the sword but learn to sheathe it. Well, that's very different than a modern translation. And I think that doesn't even have to necessarily be about being a warrior. If you're somebody, let's say you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and you're at a bar or whatever, and you're sitting next to some guy who's a true master pianist, most people would go, what do they have in common? What they have in common is they both understood the insane hours and discipline it took to get where they're at. And there's a mutual respect. And so I think those who master anything very difficult, that's who inherits the earth. And it's because you get stronger as you go up that mountain, whatever that is.
I agree. So we've covered a couple traits, 3 in particular: humility, pursuit of truth, and humor. Actually, that's only 2. What was the third one?
Empathy.
Empathy.
Those are
And
the 3 big ones for me.
I'm on board with all of those. And what's fun and simultaneously frustrating about conversations like this is that they can go on forever in terms of the traits that you keep adding on. And then it also starts to get convoluted. Where it's like, well, are these traits or behaviors?
Mm-hmm.
And then are these behaviors or are these skills?
Yeah.
Right. So if these traits are somewhat innate and hard to develop, how would someone develop them if they're trying to develop themselves as a leader? I would argue that you should start with yourself and
Yes.
understanding yourself. Personality tests are great. I've taken a handful in my time. I've also taken, just through nature of being in the special operations community, we have access to all these benevolent organizations that test our brain and our Q and how our brain works. And like, for example, one of the things I learned about myself, and I think I told you this after I went up to Boston for that TBI clinic.
Yeah, home base.
Home base. The way my brain turns on and turns off is all according to interest. So whenever my brain is not interested in what I'm doing, it turns off to the degree that I can perform at just below average, as opposed to like right around average, which is generally what they see for most of these things. But when I am interested, the rate at which my brain turns on and my performance increases is exponential.
Yeah.
And which was, I thought, was like, yeah, well, of course. But I learned, interestingly, that it's actually quite rare, at least to the degree that my brain turns on and starts to be engaged, the more I'm interested in something. And then I start performing like well above average once I'm actually interested in something.
I wonder if that's a soft, because I had that too. You know, I went up to home. I actually did NICO and home base because I'm that big of a disaster. But I'd be curious if that's because I know the percent of what I had one psychiatrist, as kind of a leading guy on that. Shout out to Dr. Goodham. That ADHD, there is natural ADHD and then there's developed ADHD. And his theory was that the very, very high percentage, I forgot what he said, 80 or 90% in soft were, and his theory was that roughly 10% of the population, you can think of in evolutionary terms, was that had natural ADHD, they were always looking and scanning to warn and move to action to save the tribe. It's something kind of inherent. And it probably follows that if something catches your attention, you become hyper aware. And if it doesn't catch your attention, you're below hyper aware, because for obvious reasons, you can't stay. That's part of the problem that we see across the community is, 20, 30 years of being in soft, you're turned on into hyper awareness more than your body at a physiological level can handle. And it has all kind of negative byproducts, which, that's a topic for another discussion, but it maps what you're saying, that there's an innate physiological part. I've heard a bunch of people make the point that, in the teams, and this is probably true in Rangers and things like that as well, is there's a nature aspect, and we recruit very well to the temperament, neurological temperament, and then we nurture that even further.
Yep.
And so you get people who perform at a very high level, but the consequence of that is exactly as you described, is if we're not interested, it's just really hard for us to I have that same issue. Like in fact, I think it's sometimes called initiation issue. Like you can have an intent to read. Yeah, like you have the book that you're like, I should read this book. I know I should read it. Some other people have told me to read it. I got an hour to read. I'm sitting here with nothing else to do. It's sitting right next to me, and picking the damn book up is almost impossible. There's a dopamine issue there too. So, which we can get into is over time, the more times you do, your body still only produces X amount of dopamine. It doesn't just keep producing more and more. And so if you do more and more extreme things, or things that feel extreme in terms of excitement, and you get all amped up, your body has to start modifying, giving you dopamine to do the extreme things. And then that means you don't get any dopamine on the lower end. Right. And so that's why a lot of guys,
extreme athletes, just push the limits, and then they fly into a wall or a mountainside.
Right. It's actually why one of the most common things prescribed for guys, particularly once they get out, is DDRIs. So that dopamine reuptake inhibitor is to spread the dopamine back out to the lower end, so that you can initiate going to mow the lawn, to do the things you're not really interested in, but you know needs to get done. Yeah. Like we see a really high propensity in the force post-retirement or post-leaving, the Rangers, SEALs, whatever, and struggle on the lower end of initiation for things that don't really interest them. It's really hard.
Yeah, I don't have quite that issue. Mine's an engagement issue. Like I can initiate, no problem. It's my engagement level after the fact. Where it's
but it's the same thing, right? You're just you're almost going through the motions to be polite at that point, right?
Yeah, that's closer. It. That's closer to
you're like, all right, I'll play the game, but
whatever. I'll check my phone every 3 seconds, and so that was interesting to learn about myself, and it was something that I wish I had known a lot younger. Mm-hmm. But the point is understanding yourself and leading yourself towards more competence and more character and more credibility, which I think are actually 3 great little catchphrases for leadership: character, competence, credibility, is the first place in that leadership development in terms of traits. Mm-hmm. The attitude and the leveraging and understanding of your own traits, I think, should precede a lot of things in terms of leadership development. Mm-hmm. I think it's a much stronger foundation whenever you can lead yourself, because if you can't lead and influence yourself in terms of understanding incentives, empathy, humor, humility, pursuit of truth, then I just don't understand how you're going to foster it in other people.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And again, my own journey is still realizing, apply the Albert Einstein to myself. The more I know, the more I'm like, God, I got so much more to learn. It was very Jungian, right? If you started dorking out the last couple of years with Carl Jung, and a lot of the internal work or shadow work, and trying to understand yourself and all these things, both from your history and or things of how you act or react. And again, physiologically, do you need to work out? Do you need to work out twice? How much sleep do you need? Like it's all of that. And if you can't at least start to pursue that, meaning have a curiosity about that yourself, I just don't understand how you can possibly lead people, because in every person's, I sometimes think every human is their own species. Like we just sort of look the same, but man, like everybody has a different story. But by the way, on a side note, one of the things a good leader does is provide, we talk about a vision of leadership, but I would say every great leader has the ability to be visionary to the thing they're leading. And another way to say that is they build a story that everybody agrees that's the story. And so they're all living in that story. Like you don't have a nation if you don't share a story. Your story is the thing that binds everybody together. And so, and then you get into, I think you and I have talked about this privately too, is as the Greeks noted, there's really only two stories, a comedy and a tragedy. And so are you living in a comedy or are you living in a tragedy? And I believe whatever you truly internally think that is, that's exactly what you're going to hit. You're going to hit the target you're aiming at. And so you have to have a positive vision. You have to be able to do it in a way that gets everybody basically on board. And so you got to understand what makes people buy into the story in the first place. And so that goes back to that curiosity about people, and having an uplifting vision, like whatever it is, man, if you don't have a positive vision, and I really mean that, like a positive vision about the entire endeavor and why that endeavor, whatever that is, at the tactical, operational, strategic, whatever level you're at, how that ties into some ultimate vision, right? I happen to call that God, but I think even if you're more atheist or agnostic, I just don't understand how you can orient yourself. I think the whole point, what is it Jordan Peterson always says, whether he believes in God, he says, I act as if I do. I think that's such a profoundly smart statement. And I would encourage everybody that we know your whole system, including the hormones you release and how you act. You can't perceive the world except in the story. All the cognitive science shows that now. We all live in a story. The question is, what story do you live in, right? And then everything in your story is either a tool or an obstacle, including people, relative to your story. And so reality unfolds for each individual based on the story that they've convinced themselves in. So if you are a victim and being told a victim story, that's exactly what you see. And it turns out to be true because that's how you see the tools and the obstacles in your life. If you believe that it's a comedy and has a positive ending, you're living a hero's story. There might be a lot of dragons along the way, but you believe that fighting those dragons brings you to a better place. And that's how your body responds. And I think that's such an important thing to understand. So the story matters, and the story has to tie into a much larger story. Again, that might not necessarily be something you have to understand at a young junior level, but I think as you get older and more senior in leadership, that needs to be something you build.
Speaking of Jordan Peterson, he's under a lot of flack from the conservative side of the political aisle after his podcast with Joe Rogan, but for calling the conservatives psychopaths. That's basically how they're taking it. But I do think his position with acting as if God is real, I think has a ton of utility.
Yes.
I would add,
go ahead.
To your point about vision making, it's essentially it's a metacognitive skill, and you can also look at it or redefine in by saying it's sense making. So you're telling your people what they're working for, and there's the creation of the story, which is the other skill that I did a stream a couple of days ago talking about, the most effective cognitive leadership skills. And the two that had the highest correlation to performance were vision making, sense making, which are kind of synonymous, and cause goal analysis.
Sorry, go back to, you think vision and sense making are the same thing? I have to think about that. Explain to me why they're the same thing.
Well, you're basically creating a filter for how people look at information from the environment. I mean, there's an orientation to it as well.
Well, that registers as sense making to me. By the way, on a side note, I think one of the best podcasts out there for sense making is Dark Horse with Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Haying, both evolutionary biologists. But they do a great job, and their book, Hunter Gatherer's Guide to the Universe. I had my oldest child read that, and my second child, my 17-year-old, is reading it now, because I think that there's a bunch of information there if you were interested about orientation to truth and sense making about the truth. And so sorry, just using that as an example of, I would 100%, you have to have some set of tools of sense making if you're oriented at the truth, to know how far off the mark am I? Am I at least in the ballpark? Right.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't use them synonymously in terms of like definition, but they bind them together in terms of like the skills, like the subset of skills needed. It certainly wasn't an exhaustive list. But
yeah, no, I'm just curious. I hadn't thought about sense making and vision.
I'll send you the study, and you can take a read and decide for yourself. But the other
sorry, actually, you made me think of everybody that I can think of who's great visionary and can articulate it. They're all great storytellers.
Yep.
They're all, which means they all have an imagination, which means they're all curious. It goes back to where these things have, they're like a Venn diagram, where how much they overlap. And maybe that's what that's saying.
I think you'll like this next part is the second skill set that correlated most to leadership performance was cause-goal analysis, which is essentially a story.
Yeah.
Linking a symptom to a cause.
Yes.
And then nesting it into your sense-making and vision-making skills.
Well, the other thing, that goes back to making somebody stronger. If you can help people understand that pattern, that you can shape the world, by the way, then you can understand that everything you do shapes the world. So everything you do shapes it positively or negatively. There's really no neutral ground. It may be a little bit positive or a little bit negative, but I mean, that's one of the things in terms of accountability that I realized I had most of my life. I was not near accountable enough just to myself to really understand, that dynamic of that everything I do actually does affect the world. It's easy to think like, oh, the world's this big place, I don't matter. That's not true. And I find that when you help people understand that everything you do actually matters to varying degrees, it helps, can be overwhelming, but it's the very thing that gives people agency. And everybody needs to have agency. If life is happening to you, I can almost guarantee you're living in a tragedy and you're a victim of some sort. Maybe not across every, variable, but across many, if not most. And I think the more you have agency and really understand that, the more you're on the path to life as a comedy and you're living a hero's story. Meaning there's lots of difficulties and dragons and things like that, but you have the ability to affect the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of, this might be a Peterson too, who, for all the conservatives out there, if you're really upset about that, I just don't think you're listening.
Oh, they're big mad on Twitter.
Really?
Yeah.
Jesus. Like, that to me is like when he says, if every woman rejects you, and he's talking to men, it's not the women, right? It's like, he's not saying all men are bad. He's saying if you're one of these people, and so if you're a quote unquote conservative, for me, he's always describing the characteristics. And if you're doing these things, you're probably in a bad place. That has nothing to do with being conservative or liberal. I've never heard him say being a conservative or being a liberal inherently is, good or bad.
Yeah, I think where they got hung up, this is my suspicion at least, because based on the clips that were posted on Twitter or X or whatever they're calling it these days. What he was talking about, how he has been studying psychopaths on the conservative side of the aisle.
Yeah.
I think they got hung up on that. He is of the opinion that there are only psychopaths on the right side.
Well, they're just not listening. He has said that again and again and again. In fact,
5 years ago, he was studying something similar on the left side of the aisle. So
I think in the same podcast, he goes on to describe the traits out of the study, that it's low verbal intelligence, a feminine disposition. It's actually that the likelihood of you being psychopath is more on the liberal side. Again, just that doesn't mean that if you're liberal, you're psychopathic. It just means on a bell curve, these traits bend more on the liberal side. So then you go, are there anything that is conservative that looks like psychopaths? And that's what he was describing. Yes, if you take these traits and you bend them in this way, that's what a psychopath on the conservative side looks like. There are psychopaths that, whatever it is, it varies. I think most things I've seen are 3 to 5% of any given population. And I think it's also true it scales online. And then, wow, I asked you, did you listen to that podcast? Their discussion on parasites was the thing that grabbed me the most, because I do think
that was interesting.
That was my favorite.
Yeah, the parasitic nature
seems,
of online content.
Well, no, just yes, but also that every institution, that parasites overrun the host when males quit saying no appropriately. Like the story of, I dork out over, I'd never heard the Adam and Eve story told from the perspective of that Eve clutches the serpent to her breast, meaning it's compassion at all costs. There was a line in that podcast that I think I wrote down that I loved, where he said, for women, the default should be, if it cries, it's a baby. The problem is not all things that cry are a baby. Some things that cry are monsters.
Yeah.
And it's up to, and he talks about what a schmuck Adam is. And that's, I love it when he says something like that. Adam is like, you see a lot of these cuttlefish type guys who are really cozying up because they're trying to ingratiate themselves to women, instead of being like, oh, you're supposed to stand up and protect them from the monsters. And there are monsters out there. And so when an institution gets overrun by the parasites, by the way, that's interesting. Have you read Sod's The Parasitic Mind?
It's on my list. I have not.
That's a great book, and it falls right in line with everything he's talking about. I would encourage anybody, if you want to either listen to the podcast, the Rogan Peterson podcast, and then on top of that, the Sod, he probably wrote that 5 years ago or 4 or something like that. That's a great book, and falls right in line with understanding, making sense. By the way, that whole thing is making sense of, there's so many things happening at an institutional level that it's easy to go, what in the hell is, like, how has, and the answer, that parasitic description is a great. And so another way to say it is, they were no longer oriented to truth. They were oriented at something else. If you put compassion above truth, right, which is compassion at all costs, if compassion is the highest virtue,
it lets the monsters in.
It lets the monsters in. By the way, again, I think you and I talked about this the other day. I always love the Aristotle. Compassion is not a virtue by itself. Mercy is not a virtue. Balance between any two things is where the virtue lies. So for all the people out there, yes, you should be compassionate when appropriate. That's empathy when appropriate. But if you use compassion when it's not appropriate, you're opening up an absolutely wrong door. And so, and again, some of that just comes with some wisdom, and some time in life, for sure.
And another one of Dr. Mumford's 9 critical cognitive skills of a leader. Wisdom.
Oh yeah, wisdom.
Yeah. I'll pull up the study and I'll give you their definition to see what you think.
I love that. Well, and wisdom to me this is where I think, I'm of the opinion that I think the Enlightenment, one of the failures of the Enlightenment is to discount wisdom. And what I mean by that is that that you can treat everything like it's a machine, and that you can understand all of the parts. And that while I think the scientific method, when actually used, not when it's fake, peer reviewed, blah, 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 but when it's actually applied, it is the best mechanism we have to figure out epistemological truths. But it cannot tell you how to live. You cannot the only way to run that scientific method experiment would be to do it over several thousands of years and watch all the people involved. So wisdom is the result of, if you want to call it the scientific method, of how to live. It's not an epistemological truth exactly. It's more of like a meta truth of how to exist. And so it's a combination of understanding when to use an epistemological truth to find the answer, or when you have to go to more wisdom. And then there's tools. I'm a big fan of Chesterton's sense. When you're taking wisdom and asking, okay, what is this? Does this still apply? Why did it apply in the first place? Does it still matter now? What do you got?
Here we go. So, although we commonly assume wisdom increases as a function of age, wisdom is more appropriately understood as a set of social judgment skills, including skills such as self-objectivity, self-reflection, systems perception, awareness of solution fit, judgment under uncertainty, and systems commitment.
Let me ask you something, Evan. It just occurred to me. I don't know, can you really become wise if you don't have an orientation to the truth?
No, because there's within that requires self-objectivity, self-reflection,
Right.
and
A correction.
if you don't have an orientation, what's there to reflect on?
Right.
And if you're not oriented towards the truth, you're not going to reflect on your pursuit of the truth.
Well, that goes back to when people say, I don't believe in God. And again, I'm not pushing religion or any metaphysical. This is, you're oriented at something. And whatever that is at the top, call that your God. Greed, sex, whatever it is, something's at the top. You orient your life towards something. And you might want to be aware of what that something is, or some things. And, and then ask, is that actually where I want to be pointed? Because I do think more and more, the older I get, I think most of us hit the targets we aim at, whether we're aware of it or not. And, the whole wisdom, wisdom's not, what's that? Perfect practice, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. If you're learning the wrong pattern, even if it might work out, you're not necessarily learning wisdom. That makes me think, the older I got in terms of training, you can see two platoons, squad, whatever, do something, and one can look like it's a total shit show and be like, wow. And another one can go through the house or land warfare or whatever, and you're like, wow, they seem like, or a dive. A lot of time you'll watch from the surface, the buoy on the dive pair, and you're like, wow, they're squared away. And you see somebody else that doesn't look. But your first question should always be, walk me through what you were thinking. And what you find is sometimes the platoon that looks all jacked up made one wrong assumption, but everything that followed after that assumption actually is clean and looks good. It's just they made the wrong assumption. You're like, okay, I can clean that up. And then the platoon or squad or individual that looked really locked on, you realize they didn't have a clue, or they were way off and they just happened to get it right. And you're like, so be careful what you're looking at. The thought behind really matters. And again, it's kind of an addendum to, if you're going to become wise, is that corrective mechanism? Are you actually understanding correctly the experiences that you're gaining, and are you open to go back and reinterpret the experiences that you gained? I mean, that's one of the things that's been certainly more interesting for me as I kind of have my own journey to go back and what did I get right, what did I get wrong, and including your own motivations, and to start seeing that there was other things at play that you weren't even necessarily aware of, but they were there, and to be able to onboard that. So the past is never static if you're really trying to become wise.
See if there's anything else in here worth talking about.
Sure.
This was probably one of the better studies that I've read recently.
Yeah, send that to me when we're done, and I'll take a gander at it.
I will. I also read another study that was talking about basically timing of leadership development and how it occurs from the low to mid and high level, and how development unfolds between each echelon of leadership. And they used a cohort of a bunch of Army officers to try to figure it out. So I thought that was interesting too.
I'm curious, was it trying to not just determine that different things happen at different levels, but there was an ideal onloading of steps. Like, in other words, I agree that different things happen at different levels and it's different for each person, but there
Yes.
probably is a way to look at it that you could focus on some, like you got to onload this before you onload that kind of
Yes.
mentality. Okay.
Yes. And so there were 3 studies that I went over this week. First of which was, I did the cognitive skills last Friday. I did, and then I reviewed that and introduced 2 more on Tuesday. First one was like a timing model of leadership. So what skills are needed and should be onboarded at mid, low, mid, and upper level leadership. And then I also reviewed another one called the Strataplex leadership skills, something along those lines. And that model was basically a pyramid where the core and largest proportion of the base of the pyramid were framed as cognitive skills. So your basic set of skills that a leader needs. So your reading, your writing, your thinking, your basic planning, your communicating, your active listening, skills that you need at every level of leadership. And then there were frames going farther and farther out that each level that you would, as you got farther and farther away from the core, the layers got thinner, and it went from cognitive skills to interpersonal skills, because after you have the technical skills and basic reading, writing, and thinking skills, then you have to start dealing with people and teams and the interaction of teams and cross-functional teams. And then it went to business skills. So the accounting, the operations, the resource management, the departmental management, the integration of all the different end codes for us. And then the last skill set, which was the top of the pyramid and the thinnest layer, were strategic skills. So that's the networking, the systems thinking, vision. And what was also interesting about it was the cognitive skills, the increase in requirement of cognitive skills had the lowest slope on the graph in terms of requirement as you went up the chain of command. So it was the most stable across all levels of leadership in terms of how quickly you needed to develop it as you ascended. And then it went interpersonal skills, and then business skills, and then strategic skills. Reverse the second 2. It went cognitive, interpersonal, strategic, and then business skills required the fastest acquisition through all the leadership levels.
Business was the one that required the fastest.
Yeah, let me
at the top.
I can pull it up. I can pull the chart up.
Now, is that a product of the reason you had it required it to be the fastest is because you simply didn't need it until you needed it? You know what I mean? Like,
no.
It's like,
let's see here. So you see this?
Yeah.
The top line, the red line, is cognitive skills. So they increase through all levels, but they increase the least. So it's the most stable requirement.
Gotcha.
The blue one is interpersonal skills, so it increases a little bit more because you got to deal with more people. The orange line are strategic skills. And then the green line is business skills. So once you leave the junior level, the requirement to acquire a skill is fastest for business skills.
Yeah.
So
I can understand that.
Those are the skills that are specific to the organization that you're in.
And I can understand too, I think one of the things to still catch that even though that's true, it's still the least of the 4 bins. It is the least
yep. Here's the pyramid.
Influential. It's the least influential. That's what you mean by thinner. I got you. I just realized
here's the core of the pyramid, cognitive skill requirement. And then the next level is interpersonal. The next layer is business. And then the least requirement out of any of the skills proportionally speaking, is strategic skills.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, your cognitive skills, you can boil that down. You know, again, IQ is, it's a good base. You know, I think there's a bunch of different ways to understand cognitive skills, but whatever, your cognitive ability is your ability to problem solve.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, they talk about that in here, but they categorize cognitive skills as collecting, processing, disseminating information, active listening, writing, active learning, adapting, critical thinking, all of which are acquired faster when your IQ is higher, but
Yes.
none of which are exclusive to only to those who have an IQ, and they can all be developed to some degree. However,
Yes.
IQ is going to put a ceiling on
All
how
things considered, somebody with a higher
sophisticated they can be.
IQ is more likely to get farther in that subset of the larger cognitive bin, which, you know,
as long as they continue to refine it.
Sure, I mean, again, you and I saw this all the time. I saw some people who had crazy talent, like athletically, like at a performance level.
We had a comment in the chat here.
Oh,
crystallized intelligence really kicks in around 40, assuming you invested your first 40 years wisely. Arthur Brooks did a great study on this, Strength to Strength.
Yeah, I've read Strength to Strength. It's a good book. I just read that last year, as a matter of fact. And I like the invested for first 40 years wisely, meaning kind of what we're talking about. If you practice incorrectly, you build the wrong patterns, you don't really have wisdom. You have a bunch of junk knowledge. Whereas if you are open and building and open to, again, understanding the past in different lights as you onboard new information, that pattern of constantly updating your system is, to me, the wise investment. And it's what eventually, well, again, gives you wisdom.
Yep. Another comment from the same guy: pattern recognition compensate for loss of fluid intelligence, and I think it has to.
100%.
Because you lose IQ points as you age.
Yes.
You can stop, or you can decrease the speed at which you lose IQ through diet, lifting, taking care of your brain, limiting alcohol use.
There's a couple of, by the way, there's a couple of interesting studies out there that it may be that you don't lose IQ points if you really eat right. There's a couple of, they just did something with the carnivore diet I just saw that may have to do more studies, but it is fascinating that one of the main drivers of the loss of IQ is related to diet, particularly your sugars and your grains. Thank you, Food Pyramid.
Yep.
I love the pattern recognition too. So if you have established the right pattern recognition, that is the thing that you carry forward and you might call wisdom. And I love, it's interesting he chose that, because that's something that's been percolating with me for the last year, is really, and why I'm a big fan of, Jonathan Pageau, who's a Christian Orthodox. And again, I'm not pushing any, but the way he describes stories in terms of a pattern of being really appeals to me. And that you understand that there's a vertical pattern, a vertical alignment, and that there's a horizontal pattern, and that those two things scale at the individual, the relationship, whether that's a friendship, a business partnership, or an intimate, your married, your spouse, whatever. And then, so individual, lower level partnership, organizational or familial, all the way up to township and nation. That it's fascinating to me that pattern seems to be the same vertically and horizontally at every single level. And that's more and more. So it's almost like you could have a geometric shape that describes reality, or describes the pattern, the ideal pattern of being. And so that's kind of cool. Again, and I could be totally wrong. What do I know? It may turn out that'd be kind of funny if that pattern was a big middle finger, like if you map it, but who knows? But I really do think there's something to pattern recognition.
Yeah. And I think it's, I think it comes on with experience and mental models which you need to reflect in order to acquire and gain. And then it comes on through, the acquisition of more and more experiences.
Right. And again, that as you onboard experiences, every one of those experiences you add to the map, while always acknowledging that your map is for sure missing a bunch of things. Whether that's 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional, it's missing something at some level. By the way, I also think one of the things that helps me is what I call coherence of truth. So if you believe in an ultimate truth, capital T, whatever that is, then that means everything underneath it is true in some way. It all has to be coherent. Like, it's amazing to me how many people are perfectly fine, particularly more and more when they get tribal, to hold two positions that you can show them that those two things cannot both be true. And they don't seem to care. Like, that always makes me like sit up, and I'm like, wow, like that would drive me crazy. Like, when I realize two things I hold, one or both aren't correct, or I'm missing I'm clearly something's missing in that formulation. Like, that's the type of thing that keeps me up, or I'm like, all right, I got to scrap that whole thought. Like,
a cognitive dissonance.
Yes, cognitive dissonance,
which is different than a paradox.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, let's walk through that. That's an interesting.
So cognitive dissonance
is dive into that rabbit hole.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance, the way I understand it, is it is the ability or the phenomenon of holding two simultaneously conflicting ideas and being totally okay with it.
Yep.
Whereas a paradox are two seemingly contradictory ideas that are actually both simultaneously true. So
correct.
An example of a paradox,
or that's my understanding.
Yeah. Let's use a leadership paradox, because there's a lot of them. I can give you a study on that too that I think you'll find interesting. So
you're such a dork.
I know I am. More specifically,
for people, by the way, one of the things I love about you, Evan, for people who don't know Evan and are listening to this, he's an absolute monster of a guy, like just an absolute caveman brute if you saw him. But at heart, he is one of the biggest dorks you're ever going to meet. So continue there, dorky caveman.
I'll tell you a story about how my nerdiness reemerged in my adult years. But from the paradox perspective, within the confines of leadership, one paradox is related to. I mean, there's a set of them, but there's a set of paradoxes related to leadership and creativity. Mm-hmm. And one of those paradoxes is that if you provide too much structure to creative people, they go bananas because they can't mix ideas and they can't explore and they can't take two separate constructs and tear down the walls and mix them up and create something new. So too much structure for a creative person is counterproductive.
Can we come back to that? I have a great theory on that specifically with great artists. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what I'm about to say will play well into it too. But on the other hand, if you provide no structure, they'll go off into all sorts of directions that you don't want them to, and that aren't oriented towards accomplishing the goal of the team that they're on.
Right. So
that's why it's paradoxical.
Yeah, let me dork out over this. Here's my theory, and again, I'll preface this with I'm probably wrong because what do I know? But I think the great artists, the really great artists, are playing with what the proper boundary is, right? But you only have so they're playing on the edges of something, but the edges of something is based on the center of something, right? So the more real something gets, so to speak. In the debate, so conservatives think the path's very narrow to get to whatever that is. Liberals think it's more open to get through whatever the proverbial door is, right? The great artists are trying to figure out where the proper edge that you still can hit the target, you can still go through the door all the way to this point, right? You go past that point, and you're doing something else. You're no longer oriented at whatever that is conceptually, right? So great artists is trying to figure out where is the proper edge. right? But you have to have a center. You have to have an ideal, a structure of something for them to play with the edge. And I think one of the things that's happened politically is we've destroyed the center, in CENTER, not SINNER. If you've destroyed the center, then the edges blow out. There's no more, so there's no artists anymore. And so I think that's
why comedians are getting canceled.
Right. And so I think that's where you find ourselves is you need conservatives to hold the center of whatever the thing is together. And you need proper liberals, particularly the great artists, to help us figure out where the proper edge is of something, right? If you don't do that, then the creative people lose their mind, right? And they don't know where to go because they're trying somewhere.
They just try to destroy all the edges.
Yeah, it's not even an edge anymore. They don't know where to go or how to.
We're just going to burn everything down and make you rebuild it all.
Right. Well, I think in some way they're making a comparison type. Again, I have to think about that more, but the edges matter. And again, if it's too narrow, then you've made the base too narrow at a population level or a familial level or whatever that is. And if it's too wide, then you're not going to hit whatever the ideal is. Oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
Sorry, I dropped sync. That's probably on my end, but I don't know if you heard me. But
definitely not on mine. I've spent way too much money on tech to make for it to be my problem.
It's not mine. I have to catch up. I'm a monkey with an abacus, and I'm just banging that on the desk. So I am fascinated by the paradoxes. Whether that is, here's the laws of physics until you get close to a black hole. Right. There's things like that are fascinating to me, but particularly I've been thinking in terms of liberal temperament and conservative temperament and the proper edge, and that we need to have a debate. The proper debate is the proper edge. But the reason, so here's another way to frame it. When we share a story, we share a narrative, then we don't disagree on where we're going. We may disagree strongly on how to get there. Like if you and your wife are in San Diego and you want to drive up to San Francisco, although I don't know why you'd want to go there now, but maybe you want to go to the Redwoods.
Let's say you lived there in the 80s and San Francisco is still really nice.
Still, booming.
Yeah.
You can have an argument of, should I take the 5, the 405, the 15? It's an argument of how to get there, right? Now, if you want to go to San Francisco and I want to go to Tampa, Chicago's not a compromise. You're like, wait a minute, neither of us.
It might be. Depends on what you want and why you're going to both places.
Sure, right. But stick with my simple analogy.
Yeah.
So, okay. But I think it does matter that you share the destination, and then you disagree on the how, and that's where the great artists and the proper liberal temperament comes up and says, hey, we're aimed at the same thing. Here's where the edges are. But you have to have the conservative who's holding on to the center, right? You need both, right, to have a proper and by the way, what worked today might be different tomorrow, and both sides have to understand. Sometimes you may have to bring the edges in. Sometimes you have to bring the edges out, whatever that is, because all the other variables of life are changing constantly. And so you can't simply slap the table and say, we're done. That's it. We need the great artists, the great creative thinkers to play with the proper edges. And that's actually a really huge responsibility. And we need some of our wisest, most creative thinkers to be in that space. And the reality is we've thrown out the center and we've left the people in charge of our edges are a bunch of, I don't even know where to begin. Like, it's mind-boggling where we find ourselves, but yes, the difference. In fact, the people with cognitive dissonance are the very people who are trying to tell us what the edges and the destination is, and it obviously doesn't work. But the paradox those are fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Those are, in fact, I love finding anytime somebody can present a great paradox, I dork out. I'm like, ooh.
I have, I can't remember if it's specifically related to leadership and creativity, or if they are leadership paradoxes in general. And it might even be both. There might be two studies. I can't remember. I'll have to dig around. But
I can tell you one right now between the two. As you need to get through any, particularly in the military, we know this. At the lower end, we actually need you to be less creative.
Yeah, you need to be more technically based, and you need more structure. And that's actually one of the key findings from the timing model of leadership that they use the Army cohort. One of their key findings and recommendations was for development of lower level leaders, they need time bound and structured developmental tasks with opportunity for lots of feedback.
That was by the time you become very senior, the creative element, the more liberal element, if you will, is critical to being a storyteller, visionary, being able to look at all those things. And so the paradox is, how do you develop the creative part at a junior level when really what you need at a junior level is the opposite of that? And so that's inside of any organization for that matter. And so, I mean, I can, without calling out names, and that's great if you're a brilliant tactician when you get to the top. But many of our best senior leaders were, average tacticians. It's not the skill set you need at the higher level. They had to be competent enough, for sure. You can't be a ranger or SEAL or MARSOC or whatever without being competent, but you don't have to be on the highest end of competency. In fact, I used to tell junior officers that make sure you're good enough, right? But if you are spending all of your time to be the number one, that's great if you're the best shot. If you're having to spend a lot of time in competitive space to stay there, you're focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah. Right. That reminds me of 2 points. One, the reason why I became I started nerding out on leadership literature. And second, one of the more rewarding things to do whenever I was a platoon commander was, I'd create my vision in the end state and then provide some loose boundaries. Like, hey, if you go over here, you've probably gone too far, but I'm not quite sure. And if you've gone over here, you've probably gone too far, but maybe not. And then let my E5s run wild. And just see where they go. As long as they're not going to run off the cliff and they're kind of pointed in the right direction, they'll run into each other and fall down, and then they'll kind of get on the same page and go run off in the same direction together. And then you have 10 people working on a single problem instead of just you.
Well,
so that was
training,
always super fun.
As long as it's safe. It was always amazing to me how many people would get so stressed out. Like, it's not being done. You're like, this is the place to be creative. You provide the left and right boundary. Here's the end state. Here's the vision. Here's the thing that defines success. Here's your left and right boundary. After that, let them go. Let them run. Encourage them to run, even if they make a mistake. Like, be the guy or girl, if the case may be, of being like, what's the phrase? Like, you got it wrong, but I like what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Go. And young people, this, when they know that's what's going on, they become like little playful. And I don't mean that in a diminutive way. I mean that in an awesome, like, you watch the stress level go down, and then they get more creative, and then you'll watch their physical skill set get crazy. You'll watch guys instinctively do things that you're like, holy crap, how they, whether they're faster or whatever, they just get bolder, more daring because they're looser, they're more creative. Like, their performance goes up.
Yep. The other piece that I was going to talk about was, and this goes in along the lines of like development and leadership skills. Whenever and why I became like so interested in the literature on leadership, whenever I was down in Mississippi, I was disgruntled for a short time because my peers were off at SRT or SBT and all these tactical billets. And I'm like, this is going to ruin me.
I
Like
remember
I am
you
getting
and I had some discussions about this. Buddy.
yeah, I am getting no GFC mentorship. And so what I did was like, well, I can't change where I'm at. So what can I do in the meantime? It was like, well, I can read as much as I can get my hands on, and I can acquire as much knowledge as I can possibly can in the next 4 years, because I knew that's how long it was going to be until I got back into a tactical role. And at least I could shorten the learning curve of what I needed to be an effective GFC, an effective platoon commander, because of the knowledge I had acquired, the wisdom that I had borrowed from other people. And what it also did for me was that it made me really, really good at creating mental models really, really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I got into a GFC role, yeah, the learning curve was really steep and I struggled with some things, but I was curious and humble about my position and how those skill sets had been underdeveloped, and very transparent about that with my leadership. It was like, hey, I am really good at a bunch of things, and I'm going to run circles around some people with a few things, but this is not one of them, and I need help. And so they helped me, and they gave me all sorts of drills to do and things to study. And I fumbled through a bunch of reps, but because of the cognitive skills that I had developed prior to that, I was able to acquire that skill set a lot faster than I would have otherwise.
I would also,
and it
go ahead.
really wasn't all that difficult relative to what I had been building it up to be. I mean, it's hard. Don't get me wrong, but I had made it out to be a lot harder than it actually was.
Yeah.
Or maybe that was just because I learned it fast. I'm not entirely sure what exactly happened, but I ended up being a quick study with those skills. And I attribute part of that to my academic curiosity that I had recultivated and re-energized. And then what surprised me a little bit at when I got to group, and then even more when I got to the platoon commander level, was how much I was running circles around people with the garrison skills, because everything that I learned at ski-yachts and reading strategic literature and justifying your own existence and selling yourself and marketing and salesmanship with, selling yourself with the due diligence that you had done. Not selling yourself in terms of like a snake oil salesman, but like I did my homework, and this is what we should do, and this is why, and the reason why we should do it is because you told me we should do it.
Yeah, that's so. For me, watching you kind of go through that and organize, I would claim, tell me if this rings true or not, is that you changed your framework to up rather than down, and so the down became less stressful. It became like, all right, I just have to figure that out. My focus is up. My boss's boss, all the way up to, again, I know you started to read, and I used to make my JOs once that switch went on for me, of like, if you haven't read the national security strategy, the national military strategy, the national defense strategy, and then I would, if you're in the Navy, you read the CNOs. If you're Army, you should read Chief of Staff, Army Chief. Like, you should understand the strategic papers they're putting out, because they're telling you what they're thinking and why they're thinking. And then you have to then articulate that. And you became, I would say, even excited from my perspective at understanding the big picture, understand where your role really was, where your stress points really are. And when we take our junior officers, and yes, you have to be competent, you cannot be incompetent. But man, if you don't understand the up and the pressures that your boss and your boss's boss and so on feel and why, you're not helping them solve the problems that they have. You are actually bringing your problems to them. And your framing changed dramatically. And from that, how you approach things. And that, the other thing that does, I think, for junior officers, by the way, every great senior enlisted I knew were brilliant at the strategic level. and could really conceptualize that. And they're great examples who could bring that all the way down to the pragmatic of here's the policy, here's the reason why. Oh, hey, boss, you want that?
Mm-hmm.
Here's all the things that need to happen all the way down to the guy with the gun. And it's such a key skill set. But again, going back to you, and where I think we fail a lot of our JOs is when you're looking up, it's a bigger world, and it opens your aperture, and you start to be able to see all the things that you could or should. And again, I think it becomes more exciting than instead of looking down. And then you also don't learn to trust your enlisted the way you need to trust your enlisted, because you're too busy doing their job. You're too worried about how you look at the platoon level, too worried about, I mean, again, you can't be incompetent, right? But the more you can be at least halfway, if not more than halfway, oriented up in all the thing that up implies, right? It just changes, again, your stress points. It changes the way you think. It changes why you think. And that in and of itself develops all the things you just talked about.
Yeah, I had a lot of success from taking a academic approach to parts of my job and parts of my development. And I did what I could to encourage that with the people that I led because of how much benefit I got. And I think they saw some of it, particularly with the Arctic stuff that I was working on.
Yeah. And you tied that to higher
the sales pitch that I had to navigate to do that. I had to embody what I was advocating for, which was doing all the research and connecting it to all the way up each echelon, all the way up to the National Defense Strategy. And my case outside of, well, we don't do that on this coast, was bulletproof.
Yeah.
That was the only thing that someone could argue against me. It's like, well, we don't do that on this coast. And it's like, yeah, well, someone's going to give me $1.5 million to go do this thing. So you should just let me do it.
Yeah. My greatest, again, not to go down war stories, but all of my greatest moments from platoon commander on up were wins because I understood the dynamic in a way that others weren't even looking at. And I ended up with crazy authorities and free range that then what was interesting is even people 1 or 2 levels up that were like, wait, and they wanted to put a kibosh on it, but it had already been approved 2 levels above them and they didn't know what to do with it. And I found kind of once that went on, that kind of became my career. And again, I had some people who were big advocates of Clay, and I had some people who really
you are a change agent.
Yeah, I'm for better or for worse. But man, once you understand how to navigate that, and you get the senior leader to be like, not only but hell yeah, and send me a picture,
And I think that translates to the civilian world. I mean, these companies all have guiding ethoses and guiding documents and guiding strategies and guiding priorities that, if you just do your research into what your company's really after, you can sell your boss's own idea back to them.
By the way, you can help your boss. I've seen this too. When you, hey boss, what's the vision? And sometimes the boss gets so bogged down in a bunch of stuff and they start saying I mean, again, not to name a few that I became closer to, and they might say stuff that you're like, it's starting to sound like platitudes almost, and make, and they're like if you can get in a discussion with even your senior, again, civilian, military, government, whatever, and you have to do it in a state of play, like you're obviously not scolding your boss. You're like, I'm trying to figure out really what you want, boss, so I can figure it out. It's honestly not clear. Like, be better. You're like, okay,
that's not very helpful.
That's not very helpful. Like, what metric are you looking for? And I can, is there a measure of effectiveness? Is there if you can be thinking that way, you can help your boss articulate their own vision and then come up with a plan for them. You become really valuable to them. And they actually end up, in my experience, every once in a while you run into the person who wants to control everything and needs to take credit for everything. And, if that's your boss, I'm sorry. But most of the time, if you don't already have a visionary, amazing boss, most people who are in leadership positions want to be good leaders. You don't know what, I mean, it is rare that somebody signs up for a job and they come into the job going, I hope I screw this whole thing up. I hope I make everybody miserable.
Or I'm only here for me.
I'm only here for me.
Those people just don't last very long. It's too hard.
No. But there are a lot of people who get disillusioned, including at senior levels. There's a lot of people who have, but going back to what we talked about earlier, who have all kind of things going on in their personal life, and they're just trying to get through the damn day. And again, being empathetic to their whatever their issues are as much as you're able or they'll allow, and being a solution-oriented person is amazing. And by the way, you get to feel great about that because you can really see, and if you're really interested in the human element, again, this goes up the chain and down. When you see somebody who's like genuinely happy that you're there because you're either taking care of them, and again, up or down, or you're solving a problem for them, or you're encouraging them to be more and creating it so that they can be more. And again, that can go up and down chain of command. That's exactly how you want to be. And if you can do that, you'll enjoy work. You'll enjoy your life. You'll have more purpose. Again, but what do I know? I could be wrong about everything.
Yeah, we don't know anything.
Nope, I know nothing.
I think that's a good place for us to stop.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
We've been at it for 2 hours, so I'm going to end the stream. We'll go back to the green room and do a little hot wash, and we'll do this again.
Yeah, I'd love to, Evan, man. I always love talking to you. I really love your journey. For anybody, I hope your audience grows. Like, you are such a genuinely curious, like, I love that. Like, by the way, you have all of the things we're talking about. I mean that. Like you are absolutely one of my favorite curious people. You're incredibly self-aware and very, very, very humble. For somebody who is, again, for people who don't know Evan, both physically and mentally an imposing person, and yet you're very kind and very calm and just impressive. And I really love your journey. I think it's exciting. So
Thanks,
wish you all the best. Yeah, brother.
Appreciate it. All right. We're going to end the stream here. Catch you guys on Friday, where I'll be interviewing a Naval Academy buddy of mine, Marine Corps officer, captain of the Naval Academy football team, all around good person, good leader. Got out of the military a few years ago, so that should be a good one. Catch you guys soon.
Almost.